we have Juan Zarate, who has had a string of really interesting jobs right down the middle of the Strauss Center's ambit at the intersection of security and law, which is obviously a big connection for us. And most recently, he was at the National Security Council as director. I don't have your title right. Director of Counterterrorism, Director of Terrorism. You probably didn't do terrorism.
No, we did. Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism.
For combating terrorism. There we go. That seems like a better title. Prior to that, he was at the Treasury Department heading the effort to stop terrorist financing.
Where the title there was Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing.
There we go. So he was, in fact.
We were red teaming the whole time.
There we go. Perfect. But so he has a really interesting perspective from his roles in the recent administration and his background in a number of different aspects of counterterrorism policy. And he's going to talk to us today on lessons learned, challenges, and continuation or continuity in the war on terrorism. And so, Juan Zarate.
Thank you, Eugene. I very much appreciate the introduction and the invitation to be here. It's really an honor for me, and I want to thank the Strauss Center, Bobby Chesney as well for having asked me originally to come. The LBJ Library, it really is an honor to be here. And Ms. Flowers, thank you very much for the invitation and the setting. It's just remarkable. I had a chance to peek into the Oval Office. Just remarkable. And frankly, I've never been to the University of Texas, so I want to thank the whole community. This is a phenomenal institution with a great reputation. I certainly was surrounded by a lot of Texans in my time. I'm a Californian by birth and where I was raised, and so it's nice to come down to Texas and to engage with you all. This is an important and interesting time, I think, to talk about the war on terror, however we will call it in the near future, as well as our counterterrorism policies, because I think some interesting things and policies being made and that have to be, I think, understood in context. And so I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about both the state of the war on terror as well as where I think things are headed, especially in the context of what the new administration has been undertaking. Much of the debate so far, I think, has been largely polemic. There has been discussions about whether or not the new administration is completely reversing policies with some of its early announcements with respect to Guantanamo and detainee policies, with other sides of the debate largely being defensive, I think, about prior policies and trying to argue that the new administration is doing the country a disfavor with respect to what they're doing. I think, frankly, we're somewhere in between. I think we are not seeing the overturning or the reversal of Bush-era policies, nor are we seeing a mere repackaging of those policies or standards. But I think we are seeing an important resetting, and resetting is a sort of an overused term these days, especially with respect to Russia policy. But I think there is an element of resetting our war on terrorism policies that's not only natural, given a new administration, but in many respects important and necessary. And what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about that as we talk through the state of the war on terror and where the new administration is taking things. I think there are three factors that need to be kept in mind when we talk about what the new administration is doing and the context for how they are reshaping our policy on counterterrorism. First is the evolution of the war on terrorism itself. I think we all recognize, but I think need to keep in mind that January 20th, 2009 is not September 12th, 2001, and that we have not only seen an evolution of the war on terror, an evolution of the state of the enemy and the nature of the enemy, but have learned enormous lessons along the way, not to mention having built institutions, practices, and standards, legal as well as normative, that deal with the war on terror. And so the new administration is handed, in essence, a natural evolution of these issues, some good, some bad, some complicated, some naturally evolving. There's also a very clear desire by the international community, and I put foremost in this the diplomatic community, but I think other elements of the international community, in particular non-governmental organizations, a thirst for a change of tone and approach, which is important in the context of how the new administration then implements its policies, or at least portrays its policies. Lastly, I think, and not to be dismissed, is the person of the president himself and what he represents, both in terms of the American experience, but also what he represents to the international community, both as his personal background, but as a new politician on the scene, both domestically and internationally. And I think it becomes very important to keep in mind the voice of this particular president and what he represents or could represent. In terms of reframing and repackaging issues, there's a certain degree of political necessity that comes with that. The President Obama, that is, campaigned on a mantra of change. Certainly in the context of the war on terrorism, he argued for fundamental changes or perception of fundamental changes with some of our policies, real or symbolic, Guantanamo being the most evident. So there's a political necessity to the repackaging and the resetting. But it's not just a political opportunity or a diplomatic opportunity, but there is an opportunity with respect to the nature of the enemy and the state of the enemy itself. And so what I contend and what I will argue here in just a few moments is that we are at a point in the war on terror where the new administration can take full advantage of not only where we have been, but advantage of its own clear competitive advantages to affect where we are in the war on terror, and frankly to see the ultimate demise of al-Qaeda itself. So there is an opportunity strategically with the war on terror. We've seen this reframing very clearly, as I mentioned, and as is plainly evident to you all, with the initial executive orders, the Guantanamo executive orders, the detainee and interrogation executive orders, the inaugural address itself, where the president spoke to the Muslim world for the first time explicitly, then his first appearance on any major broadcast on Al Arabiya, and then Secretary Clinton's visit to Jakarta, which I think is a foreshadowing of a presidential visit in return by President Obama to the place where he grew up. All of this, I think, signals the type of repackaging, the resetting that is part of what the new administration had in mind and, frankly, what we are likely to see. Before I get into some of the dimensions of that, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is the state of the enemy and the state of the war on terror, because I think that is incredibly important to help explain the choices the new administration will be facing, as well as some of the rhetoric that's being used and some of the policies that are already being implemented. Al-Qaeda remains a direct threat to the United States at home and abroad. We know that there has been ongoing training out of the Fatah. This is the federally administered tribal areas, the border area in Pakistan, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, for the last 3 years, if not longer. That safe haven has not only presented problems for plots against the homeland in the West, which we've seen evidently, but has also been an arena, I call it a witch's brew, for like-minded terrorist groups to operate, to blend expertise and operations, and to then project out. You've seen this, for example, with the Islamic Jihad Union, the East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, some of the Kashmiri separatist groups and others that all swim in the same waters and have operated in the same territory and are able then to share not only an agenda but also in operations. You have al-Qaeda that in 2006 and 2007 started to build more concrete regional alliances, what I like to call strategic outposts, with like-minded regional groups that had heretofore largely been focused on local grievances and regional agendas. Groups like GSPC in North Africa, which later officially merged with al-Qaeda, now known as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. You have elements, both historic and current, in East Africa, al-Qaeda in East Africa, with elements of the al-Shabaab movement, the student movement, with ties to al-Qaeda. Elements in Yemen now emerging with very close and deep, not only historic, but current ties to al-Qaeda central leadership. And so a very clear attempt by al-Qaeda to establish regional outposts and alliances that not only are tied to al-Qaeda, but then have a common agenda of attacking Western interests and facing westward in terms of their strategic intent, which becomes a threat to the United States even more so than usual. You have as well radicalized pockets and populations. We've certainly seen that in Europe, pockets of populations that have been tapped by al-Qaeda, recruiters and networks to actually form parts of cells. It's been a problem in the United Kingdom. It's been a problem in Central Asia. It's an emerging problem perhaps in the Levant, and certainly something that authorities here in the United States watch carefully in the United States. That said, and this is important, and it's been reflected in current testimony from the new Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, al-Qaeda is on the ropes. It's on the ropes strategically and tactically. And it is important to keep this in mind as we look at the new administration's policies. Al-Qaeda's core leadership is under significant pressure, in particular in the federally administered tribal areas, the Fatah. Al-Qaeda has lost ground, both geographic and moral, in Iraq, where a movement that was at one point projecting outward into the Levant and into Europe out of Iraq is now struggling for survival in northern Iraq. Al-Qaeda has failed to regain its strategically important foothold in Saudi Arabia, where its infrastructure has largely been decimated over the last 6 years, and where al-Qaeda continues to struggle to try to find inroads to attack the Saudi monarchy as well as the stability of the oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Major plots have been disrupted, some well known, like the August 06 transatlantic plane plot, which derived out of the Fatah, but others as well, plots in Denmark, Germany, Turkey, that had emanated out of the Fatah and out of al-Qaeda's central leadership, all of which is demoralizing and disruptive to al-Qaeda's attempts to continue their global agenda. We know that their funding has been interrupted and is in short supply. Sheikh Saeed al-Masri, the Egyptian accountant who serves as the money man for al-Qaeda, has come out publicly and called for additional funding. We see frequent calls for additional funding and support from the likes of Ayman al-Zawahiri and others. And we know, based on information available and that's been testified to, that al-Qaeda is struggling with financing and is in short supply. And perhaps most importantly, in a dynamic that's not well understood and something I talked about last April at the Washington Institute, we're starting to see, and as Admiral Blair called it, a turning point or turning the corner on violent extremism. What you have is an internal rejection of the violent extremist ideology itself, both within jihadi circles as well as with voices that are credible. And I'm not talking about government voices. I'm talking about ex-jihadi groups, for example, the Killiam Foundation in the United Kingdom, made up of ex-jihadis, ex-Hizbat al-Tahrir members, who are now making their mission trying to create a counter-movement against al-Qaeda to expose the ideology for what it is and to try to draw youth away from that ideology. And so you are starting to see in very concrete terms challenges to the ideology itself and a loss of popularity for that agenda. Part of it is the lack of effectiveness of al-Qaeda's global agenda, but also, frankly, an inability to defend much of what it has done in terms of attacks against Muslim civilians and innocents, which has been a huge albatross around the necks of the al-Qaeda senior leadership. Clearly, the new administration will have and does have other terrorist concerns on the front burner. Groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which perpetrated the Mumbai attacks, other Kashmiri separatist groups like Huji and Jam, Judd, which is an element of Lashkar-e-Taiba, that have potential global reach and if not global reach, then potential global impact with respect to how those groups can affect geopolitical dynamics, especially in South Asia. You have Hezbollah still to contend with, Hezbollah that's looking forward to the upcoming elections in Lebanon, but a Hezbollah that retains its terrorist capabilities globally and which has vowed continuously to avenge the death of Imad Mughniya, their operations chief. And so clearly the new administration has to continue to watch Hezbollah given its global tentacles and reach. And then, as I mentioned, authorities in the United States are clearly watching for signs of homegrown terrorist threats. The recent speeches and testimony by FBI officials speak to problems in some pockets of our Somali American community, in particular in Minneapolis, where radicalization has been evident, where individuals have traveled to East Africa, and where at least on one occasion you've had an American engaged in a suicide attack in East Africa within the last year. And so pockets of concern with respect to homegrown radicalization that form part of this broader tableau of concerns that the administration has to have at the front of its mind. Both where the enemy lies in the context of the threat and where we are as a country with respect to defending against that threat and diminishing the threat, I think helps explain why at the end of the day there will be largely fundamental continuity in our counterterrorism policies and approach, despite what I think, again, becomes a polemic debate about what we were seeing in terms of the administration's policies. Part of this is a reflection of the fact that the nature of the threat is real. People often quip that, officials during a campaign are able to say or do certain things, but when faced with the reality of the intelligence and the reality of certain threats before them and the challenges of actually governing and protecting the American people and the international community against those threats, are faced with an altogether different reality. And I think to a certain extent that's overstated, but to a certain extent it's true in that the nature of the threat is real and becomes altogether more real to those policymakers as they assume seats of responsibility. And a prevention of another attack remains paramount, both as a matter of national security, as a matter of strategy, as well as a matter of politics. It becomes important for the new administration not to allow an attack to happen either in the homeland or against significant U.S. interests abroad. And as I mentioned, in terms of where the enemy is, al-Qaeda is on the ropes in many respects. And so we are at a point, and I made this contention several months ago, and I make it again today, that we can imagine the end of al-Qaeda as we have known it. We can and should imagine that end. And I think the new administration is contemplating that very reality, the fact that we could, with the right degree of pressure, with the right degree of moral opprobrium, with the right degree of rejection of al-Qaeda ideology, you could see the end of al-Qaeda proper as we have known it. It doesn't mean the terrorist threat evaporates. It doesn't mean that there isn't a morphing of the threat in some way. It doesn't mean that the regional alliances that al-Qaeda has formed don't somehow take on a more central role. But it does mean that we can imagine a time when al-Qaeda Central, or al-Qaeda as we've known it, as the vanguard of this broader global movement, the Sunni violent extremist movement, no longer exists. And we should imagine it. And I think part of the reason we will see continuity is the new administration will take advantage of that moment, or the moment we are at with respect to al-Qaeda. There's also the reality that in large part the homeland has been kept safe over the last 8 years, and the strategy that's been implemented, both offensive and defensive, has, through the clear lens of, I think, objective analysis, has been effective and has worked and is reasonable. The notion of attacking terrorists abroad, of attempts to deny safe haven, deny state sanctuary, denial of resources needed to operate, the creation of layered defenses to protect the homeland, whether it's against weapons of mass destruction or otherwise. All of these things, I think, are rational elements of strategy that will be largely continued and will be undertaken. There is also, I think, a continuation of the notion that we are engaged not just in a battle of arms, but a battle of ideas, that there's an ideological dimension to this battle that we have to join and we have to continue to engage in aggressively, whether directly or indirectly, or whether as a supportive dimension or element or as a protagonist. There is an ideological dimension to this, and I think the President and the new team clearly recognize that, and that becomes a part of the ongoing nature of what we're doing. Two other elements I think are important. One, this notion of using all elements of national power, both hard and soft power, is one that has gained great resonance in Washington as part of the national security lexicon, but is very much real in terms of what the new administration is trying to do. And you see Secretary Clinton labeling parts of this. She talks about smart power, the use of smart power. I think there are elements of the war on terror that have evolved over time that actually provide the new administration with implements to actually engage in smart power. One very good and easy example, I think, is the renewed and revised use of smart sanctions, targeted financial sanctions, to affect rogue regime behavior and those trying to engage in legitimate financial activity, but who are not allowed to do so, not simply because of what state actors do, but because of what market mechanisms require them to do. And that's an element of power and suasion that was developed in the prior administration that the new administration will take full advantage of. There's also a dimension, as I mentioned at the start, of authorities and institutions being in place that the new administration can rely on and is already relying on. Institutions like the National Counterterrorism Center, which serves as the hub for analytics as well as operational planning for counterterrorism. The establishment of a NORTHCOM, a combatant command for the homeland that actually helps with homeland defense-related activities. The Department of Homeland Security itself, which, if you recall, during some of the political debates about a year and a half ago, much discussion about whether or not the department would be dismantled under this administration. And I think we're now seeing everything to suggest that we're far from that debate. In fact, we're talking about enhancing the budget for the Department of Homeland Security. The Office of Director of National Intelligence under Admiral Blair seems to be not only a vibrant part of the intelligence community, but will be reforming and revising how it operates. The national security branches of the Department of Justice and the FBI continue to operate and are continue to seem to be part of the architecture that the new administration will rely on. In addition, some of the authorities, some of which have come under a great deal of criticism in the past, both politically and otherwise, have proven fairly robust. There's been evidence of this, for example, the FISA appellate ruling, for those lawyers in the room, that was made public just this past fall. It was a ruling in August of 2008, finding constitutional the cross-border wiretapping that the administration had in place, given the safeguards that the National Security Administration had implemented, that was constitutional, did not violate the Fourth Amendment. The WMD Terrorism Commission, a bipartisan commission led by former Senator Graham, endorsed the new Attorney General guidelines, which gave the FBI greater powers to collect intelligence and information, even absent a criminal predicate. That is largely now being endorsed. The European Union endorsement of the way the Treasury's terrorist financing tracking program has been implemented. Jean-Louis Bruguière, named as the eminent person to report to the European Union on this, did so in late February, finding that all of the safeguards for privacy and civil liberties are in place and have been respected. The Pentagon report under this administration with respect to practices at Gitmo and whether or not those practices are in compliance with the Geneva Conventions, with a conclusion that they are in compliance. I think, again, significant in terms of how to reflect on how these institutions and processes are viewed. And again, the Patriot Act, which was under a great deal of fire and criticism several years ago, I think is largely been ensconced in our architecture in terms of authorities and institutions as to how we deal with counterterrorism, and will be relied on by the new administration. I think back to Jim Comey, who was the Deputy Attorney General for some of my tenure at Treasury, when he talked about the Patriot Act, and he talked about the angels being in the details of the Patriot Act with respect to the checks and balances in place. Perhaps arguably by those who don't like the Patriot Act an overstatement, but I think perhaps an accurate one in terms of the longevity of some of the authorities in place under the Patriot Act. I also think the new administration is taking certain steps in part because they are feasible steps, again, both strategically and politically. With respect to closing Guantanamo, again, a political necessity for the new administration, but I also think one of practicality, one that was coming. President Bush, if you recall, talked about a desire to close Guantanamo clearly as a goal. And the number of detainees from Guantanamo being reduced from almost 800 to about 248 at the time of the transfer of power between the administrations, with the same complications and issues at play now as they were then. Issues of human rights concerns with respect to the return of certain detainees like the Uyghurs, concerns of security with respect to some of the trained individuals for whom we may not have evidence to prosecute in a criminal context, some of the Yemenis, for example, who are in custody, and obviously process issues and concerns with respect to how to handle those who may be subject to Article III processes and criminal law processes. With respect to the CIA prisons, what we know from public testimony from Director Hayden as well as President Bush and speeches, and we know from congressional oversight that those were closed, or at least there was nobody left in them as of September of 2006. That, according to Director Hayden and President Bush, those were sites that were no longer necessary, and that the individuals that were in them, the 14, were transferred into custody in Guantanamo with ICRC given access to them to verify their existence. And so in terms of the use of those sites, practically speaking, in September of 2006, those were no longer in use from what we were led to believe and now understand. And in terms of retaining options, prerogatives that the Bush administration held central to the execution of the War on Terror, there are indications that the new administration is actually retaining those options, but as extraordinary options, which I think are appropriate given the state of the War on Terror and where we are. And so when you look at the Guantanamo and the detention and interrogation executive orders, you see that there are caveats and exemptions with respect to the extent of those authorities, as well as the creation of working groups or studies to look at the extent of how those executive orders will actually be implemented. And so there's a retention of those prerogatives. I think also there's a certain degree of legal reality to what the public policy is. Certainly given a number of Supreme Court cases, some of which went against Bush administration policies, Boumediene, I think, being the most important of them, where habeas rights were given to the Guantanamo detainees. There's a certain degree of legal and political reality as to where things are headed in terms of detainee policy that I think is important to recognize in terms of what the new administration not only wants to do, but in many respects has to do in terms of its policies. And then finally, if you look at more concrete counterterrorism activities, for example, the Iraqi pullout, the staged pullout, the mini surge into Afghanistan, all of these were part, I think, of an evolution where we are in terms of the war on terror, as well as where those theaters of battle lie. I think there's also evidence of continuity in four realms. One, in terms of rhetoric. I think you've seen in the president's own speeches, in some of his press conferences, we may hear again tonight in his press conference, rhetoric about denial of safe haven, about taking the battle to the enemy, an ideological battle against violent extremism, elements of rhetoric that may not be exactly parallel to the lexicon used in the prior administration, but certainly a lexicon that reflects a clear recognition of the battle that lay ahead in terms of violent extremism. As well, I think we can look at the actions of the new administration. With respect to Pakistan, you have continued aggressive counterterrorism actions, and as the new director of Central Intelligence, Panetta, apparently told a group of journalists, there is no change in our policy or activities contemplated in terms of what we're doing in that part of the world. You have the initial surge in Afghanistan with the new policies to be announced likely this week. You have the Iraq pullout, though, with a sufficient degree of force left behind to engage in counterterrorism activities contemplated, some of which I think was subject of criticism from the left of the new administration. And so there are actions underway that reflect a certain degree of fundamental continuity and evolution for the new administration. And as I mentioned, both in terms of legal positions taken by the Department of Justice as well as caveats by the administration, there is a willingness to retain prerogatives for the executive related to the war on terror. And you have, again, Director Panetta talking about the retention of the ability to use renditions when necessary, even if extraordinary, but certainly talking about that prerogative and the potential for that use. And then finally, I think something that is well understood in Washington but may not be well understood outside of Washington is the degree of continuity among counterterrorism personnel that are actually running the day-to-day operations of our counterterrorism policy. Sometimes I feel like the odd man out, like I'm the only one who's now on the outside. If you look at the number of folks, my counterparts who are still working on the inside. Obviously, you have Secretary Gates, but he's not a counterpart, obviously. But you have folks like Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, Mike Vickers, who is in essence responsible for the Department of Defense's counterinsurgency and counterterrorism policies, retained and still in place. You have Michael Leiter, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, retained, still in place. Stuart Levy, the Undersecretary for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which I helped establish at the Treasury Department, asked to stay on board. In fact, just announced again yesterday that he will be on board. Steve Kappas, the number 2 at the CIA, a career professional brought back by Director Hayden to help run the CIA, is retained. John Brennan, a longtime CIA professional, took on my portfolio and my title as Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism, also has the title of Homeland Security Advisor, a longtime professional who actually stood up the National Counterterrorism Center during the Bush administration. He's Obama's primary senior advisor on all of these issues. The NSC team, my former team, my deputy, and the directors operating with the interagency, all the same, unchanged. Now, these things will change over time, and personnel will shift, but I think it's not insignificant that you have core individuals operating in some of these key positions still engaged in much of the same activity that they're engaged in. And that's not to mention elements like Director Mueller and elements of the FBI that are naturally retained given the 10-year tenure of the FBI director. Let me shift now to talk about 3 distinct and fundamental opportunities that I think the new administration has and that they have and will continue, I hope, to take full advantage of. First, I think, is an element of being able to repackage our policies. I don't think they should be shy about this. I don't think they should hide from an ability to do this, nor do I think they should necessarily tie their policies to the former administration. But I think that there are policies and practices that have been successful that can and should be continued and that can be repackaged. And I think smartly, and in particular, if you look at the initial executive orders that are well known to you all, what this administration has done in terms of repackaging is to label as extraordinary or as unusual those practices that will be exactly that. Renditions is a good example where Director Panetta takes the issue on preserves the prerogative, but talks about renditions as they are, the extraordinary tools and powers. Whereas under the Bush administration, given their use, given the nature of where we were in the war on terror, the extraordinary became central, or was a central defining principle of the war on terrorism policies. And so it became difficult to argue around or about those issues, especially over time as they became more and more unusual or perhaps not even useful in terms of the war on terror. So the new administration has the ability to repackage. And I think language and tone has a lot to do with this. And this goes back to the desire from the international community to see a new face and to hear a new voice with respect to U.S. counterterrorism policy. The fact that we've gone out on listening tours and have talked about mutual respect and being in listening mode, I think matters quite a bit. And I think back to my own upbringing in California, where my Cuban mom would often tell me, no es el qué, es el cómo. It's not the what, it's the how. And so it's often not necessarily the substance of what you're talking about, but how you talk about it and how you frame these issues that I think become very important. And in that regard, I think the new administration has a unique opportunity to relaunch initiatives and programs and to repackage programs. A very clear opportunity in that regard is outreach to Muslim communities globally, something that the Bush administration tried to do mightily, but I think we were stuck in having to deal with issues with respect to Muslim communities from a defensive posture. And so anything that the Bush administration said or did was viewed through either an antagonistic prism or a defensive prism. People forget, for example, that President Bush was on Al Arabiya a couple of times. But the problem was he was on late in the first term and then in the second term and was on from a defensive perspective, defending Iraq policy, defending image issues with respect to what happened in Abu Ghraib. And so it became a very difficult posture with respect to outreach to Muslim communities. People forget, for example, the Bush administration was the first to put a Quran in the White House, the first to name an envoy to the Organization for the Islamic Conference. President Bush's first visit after 9/11 was to the Washington Mosque. He was there thereafter in the 50th anniversary, where he announced he was going to name an OIC envoy. Meetings with moderate Muslim leaders. Enormous amounts of aid to Muslim communities around the world, which largely go unrecognized, the Palestinian community being one of those communities. And so these are all opportunities, either singly or together, for the new administration and President Obama himself to take full advantage. An easy example is the OIC envoy. The prior envoy, Sada Cumber, a fellow Texan, did remarkable work in a short period of time. He's no longer in the position. So the new administration has the opportunity to rename or to name a new envoy. One can imagine that taking on great symbolic significance in this new administration with a repackaging and a resetting with that outreach to Muslim communities. That leads to, I think, the second great advantage of the new administration and of the president himself, and that is an ability to chip away at the destructive and corrosive narrative of the West being at war with Islam. This is the cornerstone narrative on which al-Qaeda hinges its grand ideological argument for which it justifies its existence and its program. The notion that the West, led by the United States, is in an all-out attack mode against Islam and Muslim communities around the world and against the Muslim world, that each and every action that we take, either ab initio or later, can be viewed through that lens. And if you look at poll numbers in Muslim countries, Muslim-majority countries around the world, the resonance of that narrative, not necessarily just driven by al-Qaeda, but a narrative that is embedded in the minds of many in the Arab streets and in Muslim communities around the world, is a narrative that has continued to resonate. And so, though you have a declining popularity for the notion of the use of suicide bombings, either being religiously or politically or morally legitimate in Muslim communities, though you have a declining popularity for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda itself, the one constant remains a sense that Western policies are actually geared toward attacking Islam itself and to denigrating and degrading and disrespecting Muslims themselves. And so this president, unlike President Bush and unlike our team when we were in the administration, has the ability, given his history, given what he represents, given where he grew up in Indonesia, given the fact that he has Muslim family members, part of his family, and frankly, given what he represents as a narrative against what is also a racist narrative among jihadis, that America is an unequal society, one that strives to keep the downtrodden down, and that's viewed through racial and socioeconomic lenses. President Obama actually is the antithesis of that in a real way and represents the essence of the American dream and is a real threat to the al-Qaeda ideology. And I think it's no secret. It certainly wasn't for me, and I was anticipating this. We were anticipating this in the National Security Council. Once President Obama was elected, we were expecting al-Qaeda to start an attack mode against him because we knew, and they know very clearly, the power of his person and the power of his narrative to start chipping away at some of these narratives that have been the undercurrent for what has made al-Qaeda popular and violent extremism the option of choice for youth in some of these communities. And so you see, for example, Ayman Zawahiri in a very sloppy racist attack against our president during the period, the pre-inaugural period, one that actually has backfired, I think, against al-Qaeda, where he called President Obama a house slave. You had them trying to lay blame on the Gaza situation, where the Israelis went into Gaza, trying to lay blame on that at the feet of President-elect Obama. You also have had conspiracy theorists out there in the extremist circles talking about the Zionist conspiracy teaming with President Obama to be the iron fist in the velvet glove. You see this narrative in the Iranian context as well, trying to label President Obama in a particular way. And so I think this is a reflection of the enemy's fear, frankly, of what President Obama represents, and a huge strategic advantage and a golden opportunity for the United States and this administration to really chip away at that narrative. Now, I think there are potential dangers of overusing the president, obviously, and overstating this. But I think there are ways of doing this in basic, simple ways where images, perhaps even more than words, will matter. And one can imagine President Obama among thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of screaming, cheering throngs in places like Jakarta or Nairobi, where they're chanting his name, waving the American flag, how destructive that is to the narrative of the extremists who want to paint a particular picture of America and of the West. And so I think the new administration, through the president himself, has a chance to chip away at that ideology and that narrative. I also think in terms of advantages, the new administration has the ability to be grand demandeurs of our allies. Again, there's a thirst in the international community for change, for a new tone, for exactly what it appears the new administration is providing, a new context for coalescing and creating coalitions of the willing, as we would call it. But I think that thirst and hunger should be used to the new administration's advantage in terms of foreign policy and national security. And that means that our new approach and our new policies and our listening comes with a price. And our allies need to be active participants in some of the harder issues that we are having to deal with. The easiest example is troops and resources with respect to Afghanistan, which we have seen Vice President Biden making that case quite aggressively now, and I think we'll see it more aggressively as the new administration comes out with its policy review. Assistance in placing certain Guantanamo detainees, we've seen that discussion happening openly. For example, Secretary Clinton talking to her Spanish counterpart about trying to place certain individuals in Western Europe. addressing the problem of safe havens, which is a long-term international problem, the problems of the Fatah, of East Africa, of the Trans-Sahel, places with ungoverned territory where terrorists have not only in the past but no doubt in the future will operate and use as training grounds. With our European colleagues dealing with the radicalization issue more directly, where some European partners have not been as direct or as open about the problems and challenges they're facing in some of their communities domestically, and where we have seen those communities then used as platforms for potential attacks and further radicalization, demanding that those problems be dealt with, since those problems cannot be isolated at the end of the day, whether you look at terror travel or whether you look at the broader problem of terrorism. The problem of radicalization in places like Europe affects the United States directly. And then confronting issues like Iranian state sponsorship of terrorism, the reality that Iran uses non-state proxies as an element of foreign policy, and the need to have a unified front against the dimensions of that, regardless of where things stand on the nuclear discussions or the diplomatic outreach. That there are dimensions of that confrontation that have to be engaged in. Let me switch now then, finally, to some of the challenges that I think the new administration will continue to face, and that, frankly, perhaps even subsequent administrations will face with respect to counterterrorism policy and national security, some of which are self-evident, I think, with what we've already talked about, and some of which I think may not be as self-evident. First, and as we look at the clock ticking on the Guantanamo executive order and the closure, is the fundamental question of how to handle known dangerous and connected al-Qaeda individuals, detained individuals, if, in fact, there is not enough evidence or sufficient process established to deal with them in any of the established ways that we've have in place, either under Article III courts, through foreign counterparts, or otherwise. How do you do that in a way that respects human rights, civil liberties, obviously, and also respects our Constitution, but that also balances security concerns? And I think the question at the end of the day with respect to Guantanamo will revolve around that fundamental question, because I think Guantanamo, at the end of the day, has always been a symptom of that conundrum, that legal question. When the international community, not just the United States, but the international community, does not have a way of how to treat these individuals for the long term, what do you do with them? For how long can they be held in preventative detention? What is acceptable detention policy? What then does the administration do with respect to Bagram, which houses detainees in Afghanistan, and which now is subject to legal challenge in the context of the Boumediene case, where the lawyers for some of the detainees are asking the same fundamental question asked in the Gitmo context, which is, do these individuals not have a right to a habeas hearing if they are being held in detention without having faced a court of law or having their case heard in some recognized court? And so that is a fundamental issue. It's why, in part, you see a great deal of attention and enthusiasm for some of the jihadi rehabilitation programs that have come under some degree of scrutiny and attention. Saudi Arabia being foremost among these, where Saudi Arabia has established an all-inclusive rehabilitation program with some degree of success, with some admitted failures, to try to convert, in a sense, those who had previously pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda or to the jihadi ideology, and to bring them back into society, integrating them with resources as well as familial and tribal support. You see this in countries around the world with varying degrees of success and sophistication of those rehabilitation programs. But part of the reason I think there's appetite for those types of programs is people are searching, countries are searching for a middle ground as to what you do with these individuals who may remain dangerous if they retain a certain allegiance and logistical ties to this broader movement, a movement that retains not only the ability but the willingness to attack, whether it be Saudi Arabia or other strategic interests. You have quite clearly the challenge of stability in Kabul as well as Islamabad, which is why the strategic review being unveiled by the administration becomes altogether more important than ever. Geopolitically, I think that becomes the grand initial challenge for the administration, how to deal with stability in that region, especially if you look at Pakistan and the potential nightmare scenarios in that context. A nuclear-armed state with growing radicalization and extremism, with a fragile political system and institutions that vary in terms of their strength in terms of securing not only the nuclear weaponry but also the elements of state power. And as we saw with Mumbai, the factor of Kashmiri extremist groups that provide an additional dangerous elixir into the geopolitical calculus. The problem of safe havens writ large. Again, I mentioned the new administration being demandeurs on the question of what to do with problems in Somalia, Fatah, Trans-Sahel. So there are real-world implications of this. How do we get development aid and assistance into these places? How do we have smart security policies that are not all sword and hard power and absent soft power? And how does that blend engaged in insecure environments where there isn't a full degree of control by government entities in the region? There's also theoretic problems, and for the lawyers in the group and the public policy folks, I think this is a fascinating question. The question of what the international obligations are with respect to the denial of safe haven under, for example, Security Council Resolution 1373, opposite the obligations of sovereignty. And where in the constellation of those obligations and Article 51 rights do nation states operate? You can see this clearly. It happened in the context of the FARC when the Colombian government struck Raul Reyes in a FARC encampment on the Ecuadorian side of the border. A grand debate that happened within the OAS precisely about the questions of sovereignty, but also questions of safe haven and what the obligations, the relative obligations are with respect to the nation states. And that plays out around the world. You can see the PKK in Iraq, in northern Iraq, presents issues. Hamas in Gaza with respect to Israel and the rocket fire, and clearly with militants in the Fatah attacking into Afghanistan. Questions of how do you blend the need to deny safe haven with the imperatives of sovereignty, which is a question that hasn't been fully joined yet. You have clearly, and I think upcoming evolutions in the Levant will bear this out quite clearly, and also in Afghanistan, the Taliban reconciliation issue bears this out. The question of political legitimacy and terror. Can we deal with and operate, and should we deal with and operate with, in toto or in parts, groups that still adhere to a terrorist agenda and that retain the right to use terrorist means, but that are also engaged in legitimate political practices or are gaining political legitimacy? And so we will have to ask ourselves this question quite clearly. For example, if Hezbollah gains more seats and more power in the upcoming Lebanese election, we will have to ask ourselves this question in terms of Taliban reconciliation. We will have to ask ourselves these questions with respect to a potential unity government among the Palestinians, with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas potentially forming a unified government. And so how we draw the lines with respect to U.S. government policies and not wanting to reward groups that retain the right and have, in some cases, gained political power through the use of terror, while also trying to deal with the political realities on the ground, as well as other actors in the international community wanting to engage. And we've seen this most recently with the UK starting to engage with Hezbollah. There are also lingering threats that I think will be central to how the administration deals with all of these policies. I think central to that threat, and something this president has spoken quite a bit about, is the threat of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorist groups. As the WMDT Commission, to which I alluded earlier, talked about, these are not just theoretic imaginings of a frothing Bush administration. These are real-world threats and concerns given the intent of some of these groups like Al-Qaeda. So much so that the WMDT Commission, perhaps a little bit more aggressively than I would have concluded, but aggressively concluded that within 5 years we were likely to see a WMD terrorism attack against U.S. interests from a terrorist actor, which is quite chilling given the potential scope of either biological and nuclear attack in particular. I think, as we've talked about, the new administration is also going to be dealing with, as the pressure on Al-Qaeda core continues, trying to ensure that the regional alliances, these outposts that I've talked about, don't gain greater popularity and don't gain greater connectivity with each other. I think one of the great lessons of the Iraq experience is that one of the advantages to diminishing the reach of a regional node of Al-Qaeda, like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, is that you start to diminish its ability to serve as a regional amplifier or a regional lily pad for the regional agenda. And what you saw both with the death of Zarqawi, as well as, I think, the pressure on Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which continues today, has been a diminishment of that regional and global role, such that at the time of the zenith of Zarqawi's intentions and power, there were clear attempts to move the movement in Iraq into the Levant. And so you had attacks in Jordan, both failed and otherwise undertaken. And so the new administration will spend a lot of its time, I think, and importantly, trying to make sure that those regional nodes don't gain momentum and don't start creating links to each other to avoid other elements of a global movement from emerging. I think in terms of these alliances as well, there's two interesting dimensions. I think the new administration will need to watch for marriages of convenience that will emerge among rogue actors, non-state and state alike. I think that's one of the interesting dimensions of what we've seen, for example, between the Venezuelans and the Iranians. Some of the commercial ties that have started to grow, as well as some of the concerns that the U.S. government has expressed with respect to terrorist ties to some of the Iranian activity in Venezuela. And so you have the potential of an alliance of rogue actors internationally that can feed off of each other and serve as platforms. You also have that in the non-state context. And I think one of the things that the new administration will continue to watch, as we did, was for non-traditional, non-state actors, for example, international organized crime groups, from becoming platforms for groups like Al-Qaeda or like-minded groups. A good example of this, some of the South Asian organized crime groups that we were concerned about, led, for example, by Dawood Ibrahim, the well-known Indian crime lord, who is well connected to Lashkar-e-Taiba, wanted for the 93 attacks in India, and became a centerpiece of the demands from the Indians to the Pakistanis after the Mumbai attacks. A crime figure, but one that provides logistical support for terrorist groups and operatives, and we know from what we've said publicly, has actually helped Lashkar-e-Taiba and Al-Qaeda in the past. And so dimensions of this where international organized crime groups, including Russian organized crime, could form helpful conduits, merely for profit or for other reasons, to terrorist threats. You also have the problem, and the administration is doing a very good job of this, and I know under the leadership of John Brennan will continue to look at this, the problem of cyber threats. How can state and non-state actors asymmetrically affect the battle space with the United States by affecting the cyber infrastructure, both in terms of private and government assets? And so that becomes a key issue. And then finally, I think, and importantly, and a lesson of 9/11, frankly, a lesson of history, is the threat of the unforeseen threats and dimensions of the power of non-state actors. And I think traditional national security policy and veterans may tend to understate the ability of non-state actors to actually involve and to propel geopolitical issues. One could imagine, for example, another Lashkar-e-Taiba attack on an Indian interest that actually spurs a regional war, if not a nuclear war, between Pakistan and India, which would throw not only the region into disarray and chaos, but would create problems for the United States writ large in terms of our policies in the region, counterterrorism concerns, and global concerns. One could imagine a Hezbollah retaliatory attack that actually sparks a broader conflict between Israel and Syria, Israel and Iran, that pulls the United States into a conflict. Again, something sparked by a non-state actor, perhaps not controlled directly by a state actor, but one that clearly then has state-based and geopolitical implications far beyond the actual act. You can imagine, as we saw, for example, with the debate in France with the loss of, I think it was 9 French paratroopers a couple of years ago, dramatic loss of life for European counterparts in the Afghan context, right at the cusp of where there's a need for additional surge in forces, where the debate in Europe perhaps has changed as a result of a loss of life or severe loss of life of European troops. You can imagine a disrupted al-Qaeda plot that emerges perhaps through a vehicle or in a way that was not a primary area of focus, or at least a primary area of focus for the public. For example, a plot that may emerge out of Canada. One could imagine if a plot were disrupted through a Canadian context, how much public discourse, how much angst there would be about what happens on the northern border, resources on the northern border, policies with Canada, which aren't at the fore now, but clearly would then have an implication for our resources and our public policy debates. So with that, I think it's clear that we have, with respect to the nature of the threat, the nature of where we are in the war on terror, opportunities afforded by where we are in the war on terror, and opportunities with respect to the new administration. A transition that allows the new administration to reset in a concrete way, but in a way that allows a fundamental and will allow fundamental continuity of our core counterterrorism policies. One lesson I learned in the White House was that you never can anticipate the next day, because every day brings a new emergency or a new challenge either to American power or to our assumptions in small and large ways. There are threats that could emerge that were being monitored, or new threats that are heretofore not much of concern. But I think one of the things that the new administration can and will rely on are some of the key institutions, some of the key authorities, a lot of the planning and strategic thinking that was underway in the Bush administration, and the evolution of that thinking over time, because these things were not static. And I think that's exactly what this new team is having to do in the counterterrorism context, is to evolve continuously what's going on, but to rely very clearly on what has happened in the past. And so with that, I'm, again, honored to be here. Thank you for the time to talk to you. It sure beats talking to myself in the mirror. And I really will appreciate an opportunity to dialogue with you about any of these issues. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Juan. That was a terrific summary tour of a whole lot of different issues, policy issues, institutional issues, state of the threat, challenges, there's a lot on the table, and so I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, and they're all over the place. Alan was first, so.
Professor Alan Truman, teacher at the LBJ School. Thank you very much for coming and for your service in government. The overriding theme I took from given the state of the terrorist threat today? So that some of the things we did before, of course, we're not doing today because the state of the terrorist threat is not the same. My question to you is, former Vice President Cheney had a TV interview in the last week and he stated something very different. He said there's been a fundamental change in U.S. counterterrorism policies, and that these have increased the vulnerability of the U.S. to another attack from global terrorists. So my question to you is, why is former Vice President Cheney so wrong? How is he wrong, and why is he wrong?
Thank you for an easy question, Professor. No, it's a good question, and you did glean from my talk what is in essence my thesis, and I take the Vice President's comments to suggest concern about the potential, because I too am concerned about potential changes that then affect our ability to prosecute the war on terror, but in large part I think. Many of the policies, in particular, the Vice President was a part of, and that the team that was in place, especially in the White House, right after 9/11 were engaged in, were policies that were engaged in trying to garner as much information as possible. Because, as I said, January 20th, 2009 is very different from September 12th, 2001, and in material ways. And one of the most important ways it's different is that we know so much more about al-Qaeda and the enemy. We know so much more about what works and what doesn't work in terms of our policies. But in those initial days and even a couple of years after 9/11, so much energy and the paradigm was directed at trying to get as much information as possible about what al-Qaeda capabilities were, where they had operatives, where they had plots. There was. And I think there's a lack of appreciation for this in hindsight. There was really a black hole and a sense of dread and fear in the government about what was coming for lack of information. And so that's why I think the policies that were crafted were largely crafted through that lens. Were crafted through a lens of we need to get as much information as we can to figure out the context to then gear a policy and defensive measures that actually allow us to defend the homeland, to avoid another 9/11. Because if you recall, the history of al-Qaeda had been of escalatory attacks. You look back at the embassy bombings, Cole, then 9/11. The grand fear was that there was something bigger and worse coming. And clearly with what had been found at Tarmac Farms in terms of the attempts to develop biological and anthrax capabilities, what was then being learned about some of the anthrax programs, Hambali being part of that and other dimensions of the East Asia network, there was really great fear. And especially recall as well, you had the anthrax letters in Washington at the time where people really didn't know where those came from. And so there was a general context of lack of knowledge. And so with respect to the paradigm, I think much of it has shifted materially because we are a lot smarter just about the context. Doesn't mean we're not blind and we don't have blind spots. Clearly, we may. And I don't want my remarks to suggest that there isn't a potential of danger if we go too far and swing the pendulum and we aren't being proactive about disrupting safe haven, et cetera. All that is dangerous. So, I don't want to be put in opposition to the Vice President, but I think there's a different context in terms of where we are in the war on terror.
In the back there? Yeah. No, it's you.
I had a quick question. How serious do you think the discontinuity will be between the previous administration and the current administration in the treatment of Ali al-Mari and the notion of indefinite detention?
Well, I think the new administration answered that by bringing, I think it's fraud charges in Article 3 context. So their attempt and desire is to try to bring criminal charges for lesser offenses, frankly, not for the terrorism offenses, and in part to avoid that issue altogether by trying to get the conviction on the criminal charges. The real question will come, and this is a question that relates not only to al-Mari, but relates internationally, again, to this legal question. What happens when known terrorists who are operatives serve out a sentence? put aside the indefinite detention, but let's say a Mutasadek or others serve out their term and will be released and claim that they're going to return to the fight with a declared recidivism, in a sense. What happens then? And to a certain extent, there may be just a dimension of risk that's attached to that. You hear this from, for example, Magistrate Judge Garzón in Spain, who says, we deal with this all the time in democratic societies and rule of law. We let murderers go. We let child molesters go, knowing perhaps that they may offend again. But it's part of the system. I think that's part of a serious debate when you're talking about global terrorist risks, though. I think to a certain extent, when you have serious individuals who form part of this broader network, and a network that is committed to the use of the ultimate cataclysmic weapons, I think that moves the debate a bit in terms of how to look at preventative detention. I don't claim to have an answer, but I think the debate has to center around that because it's a different context altogether. I would also note that the Spanish and the French systems and the Napoleonic systems have actually come up with solutions to this. In the French system, you have now upwards of 4 years. I think it's the same in the Spanish system, where a prosecutorial magistrate can hold a suspect in custody in a national security terrorism context. Not discussed much, not well understood, but an evolution of how they've dealt with, in their legal context, the threat of individuals returning to the battle space, so to speak. So I think it's a fundamental question.
Sir, in front.
I had a question on funding of terrorism. How well have we done in curbing the source of funding from wealthy citizens of some of our Islamic allies, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, etc.? Because I'm hearing is there's still a lot of money flowing, funds
Yeah.
flowing
Yeah.
from those wealthy Islamists to the many of the terrorist groups.
It's a great question and a big concern. When I left the NSC, in terms of terrorist financing, we had, I would say, two primary issues of concern. One was the continued problem of dedicated donors to the violent global Sunni extremist movement, as well as the use of couriers to move money. And so I would say we haven't licked the problem, but I think the problem is in a much better position now than it was in the past, in part because you have the Saudi Arabian government actually cracking down in robust ways against donors. You also have a dimension that's important in terms of the ideological debate, a demoralizing of the donor class. These donors are venture capitalists in many ways for the broader jihadi movement. They want to see results out of their investments. And to the extent that they're Al-Qaeda itself or Al-Qaeda allied movements are not able to deliver either with spectacular attacks or to be able to defend their actions in the relevant public debate, that affects the donor class. And I think one of the dimensions of what we've seen is demoralizing of that class, so it's helpful. There is still a problem, though, in the Gulf where there are committed donors providing funds to Al-Qaeda Central, to the Taliban, and to other groups, and that's an issue.
Hi, I'm Garrett from Western High School, and I have a pretty simple question. It's just, in your opinion, how do we end and hopefully win the war on terror? And not to imply or to force like a timetable on you, but is this goal achievable in years to come or possibly decades?
I think it is achievable, and I think first thing you have to do is define what victory means and is, and it's a difficult thing to do because so much of this is defined as a generational battle, an ideological battle. So the question is, how do you define the end of that? People aren't going to stop, raising ideas or opposing the West, so to speak. I think there are two or three core dimensions to look at. First is, does Al-Qaeda or the Al-Qaeda affiliates and the network present a global threat to the United States and our allies? Do they have global reach? Or is it merely a local or regional problem that can be contained? And I think so. One of the key factors is, are we able to destroy the global dimensions of the threat and contain it in a way that's politically palatable as well as, from a security perspective, reasonable? If you look at Southeast Asia, I think we've had enormous success there, largely due to the work of countries in the region. If you recall, right after 9/11, there was a lot of scholarly debate. Where's the next front in the war on terror? The answer from most academics and policymakers was Southeast Asia. That's the next front. You have Jemaah Islamiyah, Abu Sayyaf group, potential movements in Thailand tied to this. And what's happened, actually, has been a diminishment of the global reach and ties of those groups, in part because of the policies put in place. One has been kind of the hard dimensions of this. You've had the terrorist leaders killed or captured. You've also had very smart counterinsurgency operations underway, for example, by the Philippines in Mindanao, where they've gone out and built schools and dug wells and done the soft power dimensions of this that we all talk about that actually has happened. And we've helped with that, frankly. And so you can imagine a time when the threats are more localized, less global. I think also you have to look at the ideological dimensions. And part of this, and this was defined, I think, late in the Bush administration, but was defined well, was the notion of not trying to necessarily convince folks to like the United States. I often say, we don't have to get people to like Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola. I wear a Mickey Mouse watch, by the way. But we do need them to reject the agenda of the violent Islamic extremists. And to the extent that we can start seeing evidence of that there is popular rejection to that ideology, and that's why I talked about the narrative of the West being at war with Islam, to the extent that we start seeing a rejection of that broader narrative that then drives young people to become suicide bombers, young North Africans to go to Iraq, all the things that are destructive to those societies, those individuals, and as well as security threats to us. Once that starts to happen, you can imagine the end of what we've called the war on terror, and it becomes something else. So I think those are two components that you can look at. And when I was in the administration, we actually went about defining criteria. So one of the things I worked on, sort of, how do we define the end of this conflict, and when do we know when we're winning? And I think there are certain markers you can look at.
We're actually coming to the end of our time, and I just want to take one more question, and the gentleman over here has been very patient. So.
Thank you. Well, it's been addressed somewhat, but I initially had a question about how well we do understand the threat and our adversaries, their means and their goals, and there seems to be a tendency in the policy to kind of lump these groups, these different regional groups that never really had any intention of being global jihadist movement. They might have espoused that, they might have come up with different manifestos, but that was really only a ploy to get money or funds or something like that. So I wonder about the fear of policies that are addressed towards them that actually push them into a different direction. The other thing is about timeline. It was 8 years from the 1993 attacks to 9/11. Different communities, different societies, different groups certainly have a different timeline than U.S. policy, which tends to work in these electoral cycles. So when you said somewhat confidently that Al-Qaeda was on the ropes, it made me think of the George Foreman Muhammad Ali fight, right? Rope-a-dope. You're on the ropes, but what does that really mean?
Right.
So there's all these fears. And even with regard to Al-Qaeda, some scholars and even people within the movement themselves have said that, their goal really wasn't the United States, but it was to drive this wedge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in order to kind of knock down U.S. support, and that they would be able to take control of Medina and Mecca and create this caliphate. And I guess the question would ultimately be then, when you speak about both the confidence of being on the ropes and then the positive benefits of continuity, are we kind of getting ahead of ourselves, and that maybe that's a house built on a foundation of maybe wrong assumptions?
Very good questions. Al-Qaeda has been on the ropes before, and so no doubt you have to be conscious of the George Foreman, Muhammad Ali effect here. That said, I think there's a real opportunity here because there's a convergence of strategic elements that make this time different than others. And part of it is the ideological challenge that's underway, which is so central to al-Qaeda. I mean, al-Qaeda thrives off its theological, moral, and political legitimacy, or the perception thereof. And that, I think, is a key component while they're being pressured in their safe haven in a way that they haven't before, and at a time where they had vested so much energy in terms of their ideological program and strategy on Iraq, where, ironically, Iraq may end up serving as the bellwether for the demise of al-Qaeda, where you have in the heart of the Sunni Arab world a rejection of al-Qaeda's program by the locals themselves, enabled by the United States, but in a very dramatic way, with democratic institutions starting to form. And so I think we're at a different stage of this than in the past. It doesn't mean they're not dangerous, and it's why I said al-Qaeda remains a threat, which is why there is going to be a certain degree of continuity in the policy, because the new administration recognizes that, and they're not going to want an attack to happen. On the Saudi agenda, very good point, but that also points to why what the Saudis have done has been so critical and so devastating to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has really failed to regain a foothold, and I think one of the grand strategic mistakes that they made, and I think they probably recognize this, was the May 03 attacks in Riyadh that really turned the political as well as public tide against al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, or at least allowed the government to start a campaign that was much more aggressive and much more focused. I met with Saudi officials well before then. We were talking to them about attacking terrorist financing. They were good discussions, they were hearty discussions, and the Saudis were clearly going to work with us. But there was clearly a change in attitude and approach after May of 03. And I think you've seen that quite clearly in what the Saudis have done. And so, al-Qaeda has really taken some strategic missteps and has been pressured on several fronts. On the lumping groups together, I think it's a good point. And this goes back to the question of lexicon. Do you use the war on terror analogy? And if you talk too much about the global movement, are you playing into al-Qaeda's hands in a way and losing nuance and losing the ability to divide, et cetera? I think that's fair. But I also think it's unfair to think that the prior administration, or even this administration, is blindly looking at the chessboard and not realizing the nuance. I just finished reading the Fareed Zakaria piece on in Newsweek about Islam and Islamists. Very well-written piece. But I think one of the problems with it tends to sort of use caricatures with respect to our policies as to how we've approached things. I mean, the Bush administration certainly knew the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Qaeda. And we certainly viewed policies differently with respect to each, even if it appeared at the end of the day not to matter much on the ground. But it did matter in terms of how we were viewing the strategic chessboard. And so I take your point, it's important not to lump them together, and I think especially if the core of al-Qaeda is pressured and al-Qaeda's face has changed forever, it becomes very important to then minimize and localize the problem of these groups like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Juan.